Hello, my name is Mark Harris, co-chair of Labour YIMBY, and welcome to Left on Red. Today we are very, very happy to have Dan Tomlinson MP. He is the new MP for Chipping Barnet, defeated Queen NIMBY herself, Theresa Villiers, which we were very happy to see, and he is also the UK government's growth champion. Thanks very much for joining us, Dan.
Wonderful to be with you.
Really appreciate it. So to kick off, first question, what would it take to make Britain a high-growth economy again? And why do you think growth has been a particularly dirty word on the left?
Good opening question. So the first thing to do is to look back at Britain's recent economic history. So if you look over the last 30 years, in 24 of those 30 years, the UK has had the lowest rate of investment, when you add together both public and private investment, of any country in the G7. That is a really big problem. It means we've been living off our past rather than building for the future. And if you do that year after year, decade after decade, you end up in a rut like the one that we're in now. And I'm convinced that if we can get our investment rate up, that will be a really big contributor to getting our growth rate up in this country. Actually, in the short term, sometimes that's difficult, both politically and economically, because higher investment might mean lower consumption today, and some investment decisions take a long time to pay off. But I think, our job as politicians, as governments that are trying to turn around this country, is to tackle those issues and tackle them head on. And it's unconscionable, really, that under 14 years of Conservative government, when interest rates were on the floor at 0.5%, they, rather than increase capital spending, what did they do in 2010? They slashed it. They slashed the programme to build new schools in the public sector. They slashed spending on railway electrification. They bungled HS2. They didn't build for the future. They didn't build the homes we need. They didn't build the infrastructure we need. And that's left us as a country much poorer than we should be. And on this issue of why is growth maybe not seen as a left-wing thing, I think it's because people don't have a clear understanding of the link between growth and living standards. So in some countries in the world, if you look in the US, for example, at the data, over recent decades, growth has gone up and up and up, GDP per capita surging, but for various reasons, living standards for sort of average, typical families have flatlined for a while in the US. In the UK, that's just simply not the case. As growth increases, you can see it in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s. Growth goes up, and what happens? Prosperity for individual families increases too, across the income distribution. And that stalled in the 2010s. We've had sort of the biggest decline in living standards for generations, and we've got to turn that around so that we can help families, so that we can help people who are struggling with the cost of living in low-income families, struggling to make ends meet and get by. So that's why growth is, at its heart, actually a left-wing and social justice thing, because it's the route to higher prosperity and more security for families everywhere in the whole country.
I mean, that makes complete sense. I guess my next question following on from that would be, if it is so good and it is so important and it is so vital to everything else that we want to do, why is Britain struggling to build? We're obviously focused on YIMBYism in our organisation, but why is Britain struggling to build? Why is it struggling to grow? I'm always very conscious about trade-offs in politics. It is oppositional politics. Sometimes people have to lose and other people have to win. What is holding us back from doing it? Who benefits from the status quo? Which voter groups have the governments been satisfying by blocking growth and blocking building? And how do we overcome that?
I agree with you that a big part of it is just political choices. Often people will talk about Treasury brain and want to blame the civil servants in the Treasury. I actually don't subscribe to that view. I think the reason why the Treasury made bad decisions in the last 14 years is because it was managed by people like George Osborne, who didn't want to prioritise growing our economy, wanted to prioritise public spending cuts and investment cuts. And with a different team in charge now, I feel really optimistic about some of the things that this government is doing. For example, the Chancellor said that she wants to put an extra 100 billion into public sector investment over the course of this Parliament. And that will mean that, for example, we can bring High Speed 2 to Euston. The Tories had a plan to stop it in the middle of northwest London. We can get big infrastructure projects built in towns and cities across the country, not just in our capital. And that's because of that political decision that the Chancellor made. And I think actually HS2 is a good example of where politicians in the past, Conservative governments, have chosen not to invest and not to make it easy and low cost to do investment. So what they could have done is approved HS2, approved it with a bill, given that parliamentary seal of approval to HS2, and then said to the people managing that project, okay, get on and do it. You've got the right now to go and do it. Parliament, the will of the people expressed by the members of Parliament in the House of Commons have said, go and do this. But instead what they did, because there were loads of Tory MPs who had loads of opposition locally, they devolved lots of decision-making to individual councils like Buckinghamshire, County Council, etc., who every single step of the way, almost every single day of the week, even now, are finding ways to frustrate and delay and increase costs in that project. And that example, you can see it time and again in different parts of our country, different things that we need to build for the future, is part of why we haven't built. There's a great clip, I'm sure you've seen it, of Nick Clegg in the late 2000s saying, a new nuclear power station, it's not going to come online till the mid-2020s, so we shouldn't bother with the difficult challenges to try and get it off the ground. How ridiculous a view is that? We've got to get out of that mindset and do things for the long term again in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, politicians across the board a lot of the time do think short term. And I think it is a political challenge to work out how we can get politicians and our leaders to be thinking long term when they're always thinking about the next election, which is a maximum of 5 years away at any point.
I think part of what we should do, though, is turbocharge our decision making, our planning system, have as punchy an attitude we can to getting stuff done. So new towns is a really good example. I think that's one of the ways that we can help solve our housing crisis in this country, building more new towns for the future. But let's make sure, and I'm confident the government is in this place, but let's make sure that when we get to the next election, we not end up in a position where we have in Ebbsfleet, for example, where a potentially rare spider was assumed to be there. We've done loads and loads of studies to check whether it is there. It turns out that spider isn't there. And 1,300 homes right next to a train station with good connections to central London in that new town site haven't been built because we weren't aggressive in making sure we were prioritising the needs of people in this country, and instead we were prioritising the need of spiders that didn't even exist. So we've got to be ambitious, and we could get to the next election with spades in the ground in Heathrow, with new transport connectivity in different parts of the country, and with hundreds, if not thousands of homes in new towns across the country as well. So it doesn't just have to be all pain now and only gain for politicians in decades to come. If we're ambitious, if we're pushy, if we're punchy, we can get stuff done sooner.
So I totally agree. Actually, just to come back to that point, we hear a lot about the newts and the spiders and the bat tunnels and all this kind of thing. And there's work being done in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, which we'll come on to more later, about trying to fix that issue. How much do we have to rely on primary legislation to do that? And how much is it down to leaders, politicians across the country, in the centre, at the top, but also in local government as well, to push that through?
I think it's a mix of both. There are definitely decisions that if we wanted to make them, and we should think really carefully about whether we want to, in future planning bills, to make sure that we get that balance right between investment and some of the regulations that were maybe well-intentioned, that were passed decades ago, that don't actually protect and enhance nature, but instead all their real-world impact is to prevent building and growth and my constituents and people across the country being better off and having a better standard of living and having more jobs, more good jobs in lots of different parts of the country. So I think it's worth us considering really carefully whether there are any more steps we need to take in terms of bills and legislation on growth. But also it is about individual decisions, both on planning committees, by councillors, people increasingly in our regional and combined authorities, if they're getting more planning powers, hopefully that will mean that because they can look at the around and the economy in their regional area, they will be able to make those decisions that are pro-growth without being concerned about without being overly concerned about the concentrated impacts on some people of some new developments. Of course, we need to make sure we respect and listen to views from all parts of society when people want to chip in when a new development is coming, but we need to make sure we see that bigger picture too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's a very strong message to our supporters who are obviously focused on the planning and infrastructure bill at the moment. But it's important to say that that is just a first step, and there's a lot more to do in the subsequent years until the election.
Well, look, I've been really interested and inspired by what Mark Carney is doing in Canada. He's passed a bill, or is in the process of passing a bill, that effectively says if the government deems something a really important major infrastructure project, then it is deemed approved, and they can work out the details, make sure it's compliant with all the relevant laws. But it doesn't need to go through reams and reams and reams of process, consultation that drags on, back and forward with different planning agencies and different different statutory consultees, as they're called. Mark Carney saying, if you've got a big infrastructure project and it's on our list, then it's approved. And I hope that the government will look at those sorts of ideas coming out from other parts of the world as well.
I mean, that would be an amazing thing. And I've been very proud and I think it's been very noticeable how Angela Rayner, Ed Miliband have been getting their big stamp out a lot since the election and approving big infrastructure projects, big projects around the country that the previous government just didn't. Yeah. I mean, obviously, we all want Britain to be building more. We want Britain to be a more YIMBY country, but do we have to be honest about the political costs of that, and do we need to recognise it, and how do we overcome them?
That is a difficult question. My constituency that I now have the privilege of representing, a wonderful part of North London, as you mentioned in the introduction, it had a politician, an MP, Theresa Villiers, who took a very different approach when it came to trying to help people get on the housing ladder. Her approach was not really actually very successful at blocking homes in my constituency. Lots of new flats were built, but nationally was trying to push the Conservative government into blocking new homes, and she ended up losing her seat, as did lots of other Tories. And actually, if more homes had been built and London was more affordable, I think she'd have probably kept her seat. But what happened is lots of people our sort of age, in their 20s and 30s and 40s, couldn't afford to live in central London, so moved out to wonderful Barnet. I'm glad they did. It's a great place to live, and I'd encourage any podcast listeners who are looking to get a step on the housing ladder to come and look at some of the wonderful parts of Barnet.
It's a lovely place.
But in the end, our politics has to deliver for people. It has to make sure that we're not in a situation in decades to come where the home ownership rate for people in their 30s is still half what it was for their parents' generation. We want young people not to be living with their parents until their mid-30s because they can't afford to get on the housing ladder. And I knock on doors in my constituency, and I don't just meet families where the parents in their 60s and 70s, their kids are still at home. I meet families where the parents, the kids and the grandkids are all living under one roof because they can't afford to move out and live where they want to live. So I think that we have to, as politicians, make clear about, yes, some of these things are difficult. It does mean a bit more building in some parts of the country where people really want to live. But we cannot accept the status quo. We can't just continue as we are with people's dreams being shattered and people's living standards being crushed, because it's not just about people who want to move out of their parents' home and buy. It's about everyone who already has, who's paying through the nose for rent. I think on average, young people in London spend half of their income on their rent. That is sort of unheard of in decades gone by in the UK, and we just shouldn't accept that. It's bad for our economy, it's bad for them, it's bad for their living standards and their well-being. So that's the sort of argument that I think we should be making.
Absolutely. And as someone who's a financial advisor in their day job, hearing about someone who has 50% of their income going on housing costs, and that just is.
And you hear that,
every alarm bell goes off. I mean, it's just a disaster. Really, really big problem. on that, because the problem is so severe, a lot of our supporters, a lot of people all around the country, they adopt a maximalist position. They say, we're tinkering around the edges. We should be tearing it all up, repealing the Town and Country Planning Act 1947, going all out and having a revolution in the planning system rather than just reform. Where do you stand on that? Is the future goal a complete revolution in planning? How much further do you think we can go? And what would you say to people who say we aren't going far enough?
So the Planning and Infrastructure Bill is a really good bill. It's going to change a lot of the way that it's going to speed up some of our planning decisions. It's going to make it easier for things to get constructed so we can get more clean and green power in this country to bring down energy bills. It's going to make sure we improve our planning committees and that decision making as well, giving more training to those on planning committees and making sure that the right decisions are made by the right people. There's a lot that's good in there. Of course, there's more that we can do. This isn't the end of the government's ambition when it comes to planning and infrastructure and getting things built. Just yesterday, we're recording this on the day that Heathrow announced its plans for airport expansion. The Prime Minister, or it was briefed that Downing Street's view, which I don't think I'd heard them say before, was that they want to do everything they possibly can. They want to do whatever it takes to get spades in the ground in Heathrow by 2030. So I hope that we see that sort of commitment publicly, not just briefed to a newspaper soon, but that shows that there's still ambition to do more and to keep pushing. And to those who say that we should rip everything up, I'm quite enticed by that idea, and I'm not totally closed to it. But I do think that we have to be realistic that a big change to the planning system that ripped it all up and started from scratch would mean that you would get a lot of people who are thinking about investing, building, growing in the future, pausing and saying, okay, what do? I want to wait and see how the new system shakes out. Maybe it'll be better for me and I should wait for that one. Maybe it'll be worse and then maybe I shouldn't make my investment here. I'll go and make it in another country. I think there's a lot of sense in the approach that the government is taking, which is working with the system that we've got and reforming it in the right way. But what we need to do is we need to keep looking at what's the evidence, how much impact are the reforms that we're making having? Are we going to hit our ambitious but achievable target of 1.5 million new homes across the country? We've also said that we're going to approve 150 major infrastructure projects over the course of this Parliament. Sounds quite niche, but I think is incredibly important. So I personally, from the backbenchers, will be watching the government's progress towards those two things. And if we see that we're falling short, then we've got to keep pushing. We've got to keep doing more.
Yeah, of course. Well, that's good to hear. I mean, moving on to growth more broadly now, you are the UK government's growth champion, which is obviously great that we have that position and we have someone like you driving that agenda forward. My question would be, how would you rate what the government has done in the first 12 months on growth, and what do you want them to be doing over the next 4 years?
I think so far we've made really good progress on changing our economy so we can get growth up. I think there's two big things that we've done. Number one, higher public sector investment. And number two, making those changes to the planning system. There's still more to do. The bill's still got to get through the House of Lords and come back to the Commons, but making those changes so that people in the private sector who want to expand, who want to make more jobs for people in this country, more good jobs that people can do that are high paid and can improve our country's productivity. We have made big changes on that front too. As I say, there is more to do, but it is a really good start. And there's other things that we're doing too to try and reduce energy bills. I think that I've been quite excited by John Fingleton has been appointed to look at the regulation for nuclear power in the UK, the Nuclear Regulatory Task Force. Yep. I think that's going to report later this year. And I hope that the Chancellor and Ed Miliband will take on board the recommendations that he comes up with, because in the end, all the evidence points to the fact that the cheapest form of power in the UK could be nuclear. Now, it's not at the moment. We've just seen the numbers on the new power station that's going to be built in Norfolk. I think, tens of billions of pounds. It doesn't need to be like this. In the 1950s, the Queen couldn't stop forgoing and opening nuclear power plants that the technology that we were pioneers in the whole world. Every 6 years or so, there was a new nuclear power station opening, bash, bash, bash. why can't we be in that place again? And one of the answers is the regulation that we put around nuclear that doesn't really make it much safer, but that just increases the cost. Other countries are able to build these nuclear power plants and build them much more cheaply. So we should be looking really closely at what they're doing, and I hope John is with his task force, and taking on board those recommendations and making progress there too, because cheaper bills for people in the long term is better for our economy too.
Right. And we have in the UK, I think it's fair to say, the most expensive industrial energy prices almost anywhere in the world. I don't know what you have to say to people who say that that's not that important. To me, huge input cost, obviously going to be hugely important. I mean, the South Koreans are going around the world building nuclear power stations very cheaply, much cheaper than they're being built here. Should we be just going to South Koreans and getting them to come over and build us a nuclear power station that's really modern, really good and cheap? Or is it more important to build up that industry ourselves?
That's a good question. I think we should be looking at what they're doing in terms of their construction and their safety and their rules. And if they want to build a carbon copy of a plant that their agencies are confident is safe, that we're confident is safe, can we sort of pick it up, as it were, and transfer it here? I think we should be looking at those sort of things. We should be doing it with countries that we trust and that we have good partnerships with. But at the same time, I'm quite interested in the fact that the UK state, it used to have a lot more capacity. It used to have a lot more capability. You know, I don't know who the director in the DESNZ department is for nuclear power. I doubt they built a nuclear power station before. I'm sure they're very good at their jobs, and I wouldn't want to denigrate them in any way. I bet in decades gone by, the person in charge of nuclear power in the UK state had been closely involved in the construction of all those nuclear plants that the Queen was busy opening in the 1950s. And I hope that government can think really carefully, and I think we should be thinking really carefully about what we can do to improve the capacity for the public sector to understand the technology, the construction of some of these big projects, so that we can, if we're contracting, so we can contract better, but also maybe so we can actually do it ourselves and do it more cheaply. Because often you do see that with big outsourcing, it's not quite outsourcing, in some ways it is getting another country to build your nuclear power plant. That's when costs increase can come in, because it's really difficult to manage those costs from afar if you don't have the capability within the state. So this is not me calling for a massive expansion of the state tomorrow and us being able to build all our nuclear power stations in-house. But I think we've got to think really deeply and carefully about these questions so we can bring down the costs of nuclear, get it built more quickly, more cheaply, and do so in a way that's safe for people as well, because that's really important. I think there's an American company that wants to build a nuclear power plant without any taxpayer money in Wales, and they're struggling with the regulatory system at the moment. Let's get them through, and let's get them able to build and provide those good jobs for people who want them.
I mean, that's what we want. And actually, you talk about the UK as a whole. We have in the private sector a very well-established nuclear industry. That we have Rolls-Royce that is building small nuclear power plants for submarines, very similar to a modular reactor. We have that industrial base here. We can increase it, we can improve it, and get that kind of those kind of projects built here as well. It just, I think, it requires a bit of creative thinking and just trying to find something that can work rather than being wedded to the ideas of the past, which haven't worked quite so well.
Yeah, and look, it is worth saying that a big part of where we are now in terms of lots of these things is a legacy of Thatcher. So people who want to maintain the status quo on the left are saying really they want to stick with a Thatcherite system of a smaller, less able state, and a private sector doing all the delivery. Now, I think the private sector's got a massive role to play. I'm interested and excited about the fact that the private sector is going to be able to build Heathrow expansion. I'm all about making sure that we can unleash the capabilities and abilities of people who are working in the private sector and growing our economy. But we've got to make sure we get that balance right, and we don't end up with an under-resourced, underpowered and unable state that isn't able to work really productively with the private sector to get the infrastructure built that we need. And I would suggest that probably Margaret Thatcher got that balance wrong, and maybe there's work for us to do in this government and in the future on the left to think really deeply about how we can right that balance so it's good for growth, good for business, and in the end good for all of us, because I want my constituents to have lower energy bills.
Yes, of course. And actually, it's interesting that you say that, because to a lot of people who criticise the Labour government as being just like the Tories, I think you've just elucidated a point that the Labour movement, the Labour Party, the Labour government does believe in a more interventionist state than their contemporaries across the aisle. And you've explained that very well. You've also said in the past that Britain is broken. To what extent is Britain broken is really what I would like you to explain. We're hearing a lot in the debate, in the discourse about, is Britain broken across a whole range of metrics, on crime and social order, on welfare, on industry, all across the piece. How is Britain broken? How broken is it? And what are the structural reasons for that?
I wouldn't want to overdo it and say the whole country is totally broken. I think we've got loads of fantastic people, loads of fantastic places, world-leading companies and industries. Our system of government works. We have a strong democracy. Like, there's lots of things, our culture, our media. There's so many things that are really good about this country, and we've got so many strengths to build on. But when you're in a position where you've had the longest squeeze on wages since Napoleon was making his way around Europe, when you're in a situation where our productivity has grown, I think, by 0.2% a year since the financial crisis, when it had been growing steadily for decades at 2 or more % a year, when people can't afford to have a home of their own, there is a lot that is broken with our economy and with our economic model. And if we don't face up to that fact, if we just pretend that, oh, we just need a few small changes here and there and everything will be fine, then I worry about where politics will go and where people will turn to next. It's on us to deal with these really difficult trade-offs, because there are always trade-offs, you mentioned that, but to find a way through and to do so in a way that isn't sort of timid and cautious, but that understands there are some really big, deep-seated problems of the way our economy works for everyday people. And if we don't fix them, people will look to someone else. They definitely won't look to the Tories next time. They'll look elsewhere for answers. And I worry about the answers that other people might be wanting to put forward.
I worry about that a lot as well. I know a lot of people do. Do you think in the run-up to the election, Labour was honest enough with the public about the trade-offs that were necessary? And what trade-offs do you think are necessary that the government should be honest with the public about, and how do we overcome them? I'm conscious that a lot of people, it's natural, they want to assume that the answers are going to be win-win. Often not the case. And I think government needs to be honest with people about those trade-offs. What is your view on that?
I think the biggest sort of trade-off we have at the moment is a result of higher interest rates that happened around the world, but that Liz Truss definitely didn't help us in the UK when it came to fast rising interest rates when she was in power. And we're now in a place where, you know, the Bank of England base rate is around 5%. It used to be at 0.5%. And what that means is that the government used to spend around 40, 50 billion a year servicing its debt interest costs. It now spends 110 billion pounds a year on that. I think, you know, our policing and our schools budgets are many, many multiples smaller than that, right? So this is a big amount of money. It's not bigger than the NHS budget. That's ginormous. And we have to reckon with the fact that interest rates are high, that borrowing costs for the government are high. And yet, because we haven't grown as a country, our tax take is higher as a share of GDP than it's ever been since the Second World War. It's still lower than in many other countries, we should say. And so getting that balance right between wanting to invest in our public services and invest in making sure the state's able to do the things that people expect it can do, that the Labour government delivers when it comes to improving our public services, but also not borrowing excessively like the Tories did. They pushed public debt from around 50% of GDP to 100% of GDP, even though they pretended they were working hard to cut the deficit. They were just massively increasing the debt. So finding that balance on that triangle between making sure we don't borrow too much like the Tories did, making sure taxes don't continue to ratchet up and we end up with higher taxes that stymie growth, but also making sure that we can find a way to increase investment in our public services. Look, that is really, really difficult. That's really difficult. I think the way out, of course, I'm going to say this, it's what I've believed for a very long time, is economic growth and is finding that way to bring in more revenues. But I would say that we've also got to be really honest about public expenditure. Now, not to comment on the detail of the reforms that were proposed before on welfare, because I know the Labour Party had a lot of backwards and forwards over them. But I do think we've got to be really hard-headed about the fact that a working age welfare bill that goes up from 30 billion to 50 billion to 70 billion in the space of half a decade or so, that just isn't sustainable. It's clearly not working. It's not working for people who are receiving the benefits because the system's going out of control. And if we don't find a way to rein it in, I'm sure others will find a way to massively rein it in, which won't be good for anyone who relies on the social security system. And so on those sorts of things, I think this government has to find ways to show that we can find ways to rein in expenditure and not just continue to ratchet up spending. And I should say on welfare, the previous plan wasn't to cut spending. It was just to make the increase 15 billion rather than 20 billion. And I think those sorts of changes, that's one of the difficult things that Labour government's got to look at too, so that we can make sure we're spending money where it's needed rather than where it might not ideally be going.
So you say that, the increases in welfare spending is not sustainable. And there were these proposed cuts which weren't brought through. They couldn't get them through. Those cuts, as you say, it wasn't a cut. It was just it was reducing the increase from 20 billion to 15 billion just by the end of the Parliament, which is, just a few years away now. And beyond that, it's due to increase even more. So if the government wasn't able to get through that amount of cut, are you worried about what comes next? Are you worried about what the bond markets are going to say? Are you worried about the next fiscal event in October? And are there going to be tax rises? What do you think the government should be doing to make sure that they can actually keep a rein on the state finances?
So I think on that specific issue, it was about the specific policy that was put forward. I think the Prime Minister said it was a rushed process. Obviously, lots of my backbench peers raised issues publicly. I don't think that means that we're still putting to bed the idea of reforming our welfare system. There's a lot we're doing with job centres to support people into work. The universal credit changes that we're proposing should help too. And I'm sure that the government will be thinking about what can we do to make sure we continue to provide support for those who need it, but make sure that we don't have every few years that bill going up by 20 billion. We just can't be in a place where every few years it's going up by 20 billion. I'm sure that's something the government is thinking about, and I would encourage them to do so. And then when it comes to the budget later in the year, we sort of have to be realistic and honest that we are in a difficult fiscal position. We inherited it from the last lot, with all these spending commitments that they'd made. There was no money allocated for it, with the asylum bill going out of control and again not being budgeted for. And then the bigger thing is that we inherited a really weak economy, been stagnant for a long time, and with high interest costs. I think the route out to this has to be a budget that continues to double down on the need to get growth up in this country. And I would hope the government will be looking really closely at the tax reforms that we could make to increase growth, to support investment, to support people who want to work harder, who want to work more hours or expand their business, and think about what can be done there. Now, I'm not going to go into any detail of the specifics of what the Chancellor should or shouldn't do. You definitely wouldn't expect me to do that, and that's way above my pay grade. But I know that what the Chancellor will be doing is making that judgment call on the balance between all these different trade-offs. And, I trust her to make that call. I think I thought the budget last year was the right budget for the country. We'd come in with that difficult inheritance, and she made some really big decisions, yes, to increase taxes. Yes, we've had a lot of pushback on some of those taxation increases, but we wouldn't have been able to have a falling waiting list in the NHS, I think 7-8 months in a row now, more or less. We wouldn't have been able to have, in my constituency, the number of local police in the borough of Barnet. Was it something like 200? It fell to 80 under the Tories. It's now back up to 100 again. People are beginning to see the change, that the investment that we made. So the Chancellor got the balance right last time, and I'm confident that she'll get the balance right again later in the year.
Okay, very good. Our final question. Going back to growth, we'll finish on growth because you are the UK government's growth champion. So growth, really, really important. We all want growth. Growth is the best. We love it. However, there are trade-offs. Say it once more for the final time. What would you give up personally in order to achieve growth? Or what would you ask your constituents to give up to achieve growth?
Oh gosh, that's a difficult question. What would I give up in order to achieve growth? Let me give you one very specific example.
Yeah.
I think that Heathrow should expand. I think that if we don't have a third runway, other countries will have a third or fourth or fifth or sixth runway, and it will be workers in this country that lose out. And I don't think that yes, I really do think we need to get to net zero and make sure we stick to our climate ambitions. I think if it means that domestically we have higher emissions because of an additional runway, then we need to go as fast as we can on getting to cleaner fuel. We need to go further with what we can do to offset our carbon and to go further on greening our grid, etc., etc. We can get there with an expanded Heathrow. But what it will mean is that some people in some parts of London will have a few more planes flying over their head. I would accept that. If I lived under a flight path, that's the sort of thing that I would be happy to accept.
Okay. Yeah. Good answer. Love it. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Mark Harris. This has been Left on Red. Please like, subscribe, and join us next time.